Hi, so I'm Emma and I'm here with Jenna, and today we're going to talk about EAD, Encoded Archival Description. So before we start, just a couple of things. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so please just stay muted and hold your questions till then. I am recording this and I will send everybody an email with a link to the recording. We do put it on our YouTube channel. And then please stay muted with the microphone off until we get to the Q&A, and then feel free to unmute and fire away. So I'm Emma and Backlog is my company. We're an archival consulting firm. We do some genealogy research. We do a ton of archival stuff, but we really help smaller places bring their collections online. So in archives, we do archival needs assessments, which are a visit that kind of ends in a roadmap. Like you have a bunch of stuff and you have volunteers, but what do we do with that stuff? That's what an archival needs assessment is great for. And we can also help you write plans to digitize items. Like what's the DPI? How do we scan this? That's what a digitization plan would come in handy for. We also do genealogy research. And if you're an archivist in here, I'm sure you guys are great at that. And then we also do some oral history. So we put together a couple of books for families, and then we've done a series of interviews. So very quickly, I'm Emma. I founded Backlog in 2021. Before that, I worked as a university archivist, and before that, I worked in genealogy and local history reference. But I'm going to pass it over to Jenna now.
Hi, I'm Jenna. So I am a museum archivist, but before that I was a university archivist, and I was solo, so it was just all me doing stuff, doing whatever needed to happen in the archives. So my EAD experience is from participating in a consortium called RIAMCO. It's Rhode Island Manuscript and Archival Collections Online. So all of our EAD from a bunch of different institutions all goes into one portal. And I'll talk a little bit about regional aggregations of finding aids and how people can access and find them at the end of this presentation. So I guess let's get started. Next slide, please. So the scope of this presentation is to talk about the basics and foundational concepts of encoded archival description. I'm not going to go through every tag, this isn't a tutorial, but I'm presenting with the assumption that the audience is familiar with finding aids and the idea of encoding. If you've done a bunch of finding aids and are hoping to go deeper, this might not be what you're looking for, or if you've if you're not familiar with archival processing, then this also might not provide what you're looking for. But like, obviously everyone is welcome. I'm not trying to kick anybody out, but I want to set expectations because there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to go over the parts of a finding aid in EAD, kind of just how it structures data, how you actually go about encoding your metadata, and how archives themselves become data through EAD. And I want to talk about like why do we even encode our finding aids? What do we do with these documents that we can't do with a plain text finding aid? And hopefully there are no typos in any of my code examples in this presentation, but also keep in mind that everything in here is an example and it's not meant to be a template, because there are a lot of resources online that go much deeper and are very precise and have lots of examples. So I'm just giving you an overview. Next slide, please. So EAD 2002 and DACS, which is Describing Archives, a Content Standard, were actually published around the same time in 2002. So DACS dictates the content that belongs in archival description. And so it's like how you write a finding aid when you have a collection of materials. You have the types of notes that you need to have, like the biographical note, access and use notes, where you get that information, how you find the names of the creators, things like that. EAD structures it so that it's machine readable and then can be displayed dynamically on the internet. And so it's the code for EAD is maintained and updated by the Encoded Archival Standards section steering committee of the Society of American Archivists. And so they maintain it on GitHub. And then EAD3 came out a couple of years ago. And some of the fields that, some of the tags in EAD 2002 were deprecated and replaced with new ways of structuring information. But EAD 2002 hasn't totally gone away, and it's not completely different. So I'm kind of gonna be giving examples and talking, because the basic assumptions are the same. So we're gonna kind of be talking about both. Don't worry. So next slide, please. So EAD is a form of XML, which stands for extensible markup language. So if you've ever done any sort of website coding, HTML, hypertext markup language, that's, was used to build the early web and is still the kind of the underpinnings of the web. That is also a markup language. The idea of a markup language is that it takes the content, so the text, images, media, whatever, and marks it up. And in doing that, indicates what it is and tells a computer how to read and display it. So that way it can be presented the way that you want. So the example here is just in describing in a finding aid. This is XML, not HTML. So HTML is very rigid. XML is extensible. So that's why we can have all of these very specific tags in our finding aids. So a subject heading for a genre or form. So we're specifying that these are photographs. Within the tag, the element is genre form. This is the tag that we use when we're talking about the form that a physical object has. And then we have the attributes. So you'll see that it says source equals AAT, which is the art and architecture thesaurus. So that's an attribute. So a lot of tags will have attributes that further specify and give additional context to the thing that the element is describing. And then, of course, the word photographs is the text that's going to display. So the number of attributes can get really long, but I'm going to keep it pretty basic for this presentation. I think that's all I had to say about this. So I could say more, but next slide, please. So when you are coding, there is a sort of first in, last out rule. So you can kind of see in this example, the first tag is a C or container tag. And that is the first tag we see, and then it's also the last tag that we see. So it's like Russian dolls. So if you start with C, that's not the first tag that you close out. So we nest them, and eventually you get to a sort of concentric core thing. So all the box and folders are part of the did, which I will talk about that type of tag, and the container tags. Those are at the very center. And then the overarching container is the thing that describes everything inside it. So you can also think of it as a folder inside a folder inside a folder. So if your tags are not closed out properly, your document won't work. You'll also see in this example, I have a little comment at the top. This is add folder numbers here. So that little structure of the opening caret, exclamation mark, 2 dashes, that structure is how we comment our code, which is we add notes that don't display. That little opening marker tells the computer not to read it. So that's where we can leave notes to ourselves. We can leave notes to other people coding. We can explain things, like if you make an EAD template, you can kind of provide instructions within the template so that it's easy to go back and do the same thing over and over again. And you'll also see throughout these examples, when you are setting off your attributes, like here, box and folder. So the container in this example is the tag element. And then there's an attribute for type. There are 2 types of containers here, box and folder. So we need to set those off with quotation marks. So these are just things that you will see as you become more familiar with EAD. Next slide, please. So the point of having machine readable finding aids allows for improved discoverability and standardized structuring of our collections data, and also offers a lot of possibilities for like digital humanities work. So someone could do textual analysis on, say, 1,000 finding aids, run a program and look at like, how is this particular concept described in the biographical and historical notes, or with particular subject headings related to the content of different collections, which are used most often, are like two like simple, excuse me, if there are two similar concepts, which one is used more often in finding aids? So having things encoded lends itself to that type of analysis, and also having things structured allows us to make changes to the display really easily. You don't have to say, okay, I want all of my link colors to change, or if I'm adding a script that allows for previews to show up, you don't have to then recode every single link. It's your EAD style sheet allows that for those sorts of possibilities. And I'll get, once again, at the end, I'm hoping that this isn't much of a teaser, but at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some efforts to really bulk up the internet presence of finding aids and putting a lot of them together. Next slide, please. So before you get started with coding, consider if you have these three things, which are also, these are also like the three things to consider before you do digital preservation, before you do really any sort of project. Do you have whatever software or you're going to need your software? Do you have the hosting, so the technology that you're going to need? And do you have the staff capacity, both in terms of time and also people? You might say, oh, I've got lots of people, but they've got other stuff to do. And you don't have to encode your finding aids. Like, you're not necessarily being left behind or doing archives wrong if you don't encode your finding aids. If your current system of description and access is working for you and your users, or if you just can't take it on right now, like, I'm not here to be like, this is what you're supposed to be doing. So this offers some new possibilities, encoding does, but it's not the only way to describe your collections or provide access to them. And you're still, if you're writing a finding aid in Microsoft Word, you're, according to DACS, you're still writing a finding aid and your materials are still fully processed. So EAD is just kind of a cherry on top, but it doesn't indicate a sort of completeness. Like, you're not, I hope I'm making this clear. You're not processing your collections by not writing EAD finding aids. But if you are getting started with EAD, you can start with existing finding aids where you've already got all of that content and you just have to encode what's already there. Or if you can start with a collection that has no finding aid. So you're writing both maybe you never even write a sort of text-based Microsoft Word version and you just write it all in the XML document. So you can start from either of those positions. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, EAD3 was released in 2015. And you can kind of see here, this is just honestly a screenshot from the SAA website, is a crosswalk between DACS, EAD 2002, EAD3, and MARC for like library cataloging. So what a crosswalk does is explains for a certain type of information, so say, where, let's say the title of the thing, where do you put that information in DACS, so a non-coded standard, in EAD 2002 and in EAD3. This was actually developed when EAD3 was still a draft, and if you're doing MARC cataloging. So they're actually, that probably wasn't a great example for me to do because they're all very, very similar across EAD 2002 and EAD3. But some parts of the structure do change. So if you've got your DACS book in front of you and you're processing and you're like, okay, I've got this particular note or this particular piece of information that is dictated by this particular section of DACS, where is that going to go in the EAD part of the finding aid? What tags are going to structure that? Then you can look at a crosswalk like this and see, oh, okay, this needs to be like a unit ID, unit title. This is where that information goes. You can almost think of it as like putting a puzzle together, but you have like the outline of all the puzzle pieces. This isn't a very good example. Or like doing a mosaic. Everything like has like a particular paint by number. Maybe that's the best. I'm just riffing. You have kind of the shape that everything is supposed to be, but you need to put things into it. You have all of your paints and you have to put them into the right areas of your paint by number. I will stop trying to come up with metaphors. Next slide, please. Oh, and actually one other thing I wanted to mention is if you are working, if you have a hosting platform that was hosting EAD 2002 finding aids, it might not be able to host EAD 3 because of like it's structured around older elements. Like my regional actually is still using EAD 2002. EAD 2002 still works. It's just not like the highest standard right now. It's like using an older version of a piece of software. So like don't panic if you're not fully up to EAD 3 yet. So when you get into a finding aid, the beginning of any finding aid is a declaration of the technical standard. So explaining that it's XML. There is a summary of the finding aid and its different versions, all that sort of administrative information, and a statement about the creation of the finding aid, like whose work went into writing this, encoding and processing it. When was it done? Next slide, please. And then you will have the information about the collection. And so like all of your notes, your biography and history information, your subject headings, information about access and use, copyright, bibliography, things like that. And then at the end is your collection inventory, just like it would be in a paper finding aid. And in the EAD standard guidelines, there are minimum levels of description and optimum levels, which are similar to if you were just typing out a finding aid like in Microsoft Word. There are minimum fields that are required, and then the more fields that you actually include, you work your way up to an optimum level of detail and context in your finding aid. Next slide, please. So to start off with the declaration, because XML can define a multitude of things according to different schemas, EAD is not the only type of XML schema. We have to say actually what schema it is. And this is the extensibility part of XML. You could write an EAD schema that does other stuff. But there is a sort of external document that uses the rules of XML to build its own schema. This sort of information, you're going to be copying and pasting from somewhere. Like you're not going to actually have to like write all of this out. So in looking at example finding aids, you're going to see this information. So this just tells the XML document, okay, we're using EAD, so we need to apply the rules of EAD to this document and make sure that the document is readable and displayable according to the rules of EAD. Next slide, please. I lost my place in my notes. There we go. So as I mentioned, the schema EAD is managed by the Society of American Archivists, and so the schema is actually linked as part of the document. So when your web browser or whatever piece of software goes to read it, they reach out, they pull that schema, and then they know this is how the document is supposed to be structured. Next slide, please. So in the beginning, you're opening with XML, and then you start with your EAD tag. And you can kind of see from this example, like I don't have any content in this example, but I've nested. These are just what some of the tags are going to be, and some of the different parts are going to be going forward. So within the everything basically is going to go in this EAD close EAD tag. The first thing that you encounter is the EAD header or control. These are two kind of similar, they do similar things, but they're not structured similarly. So we don't actually use the EAD header anymore, we use control. So in general, the elements that are in this part of the finding aid also define the repository, the standards used, for encoding specific information like your dates, languages, things like that. Like what language is this finding aid in? So next slide, please. And then you'll also have the file description in this area. So a title and publication statement. What's the title of the collection? The title of the finding aid is similar to and includes, but is not the same as the title of the collection. So oftentimes you'll see the title of the finding aid is Guide to such and such papers. And then we also talk about the maintenance history of this particular document. So let's say you've added new information to the biographical and historical note, or you have a new accrual for this particular collection, or you corrected something like, oh, we thought that this person in these photographs was this person, but it's actually someone else. You describe when and who did those changes and just kind of summarize what they were. And I mean, I recommend keeping, your old versions of your finding aids, within your documents for your institution, but you don't need to have all of the old versions online. And this maintenance history, kind of like with like a Wikipedia history page, it shows like what have we changed, so we're not just making changes and erasing them and erasing that history. We're showing our work, essentially. Next slide, please. So the next big tag we're going to encounter is the archival descriptions section, or the arch desk. Sometimes I find that we're just like saying the names of the tags. We're like the C, the did, the arch desk. So the archival descriptions section is going to include just about everything. So you are gonna have a did tag which is I can actually remember what it stands for, which is why I always just call it the did tag, but it's for specific descriptive identifying information. And so you're going to have those types of tags throughout the finding aid, and we'll get more into them later. So the information about the creation of the finding aid will be in this part. Next slide, please. And then also the DSC section includes information, all of your scope and content notes, access, use, biographical statements, things like that. And the rest of the finding aid content is within this tag. And it's all nicely nested. Next slide, please. So you're going to have your descriptive terms, these, your controlled vocabularies, personal names, corporate names, subject terms, genre terms, things like that. And you're going to use control access fields for all of those, for any access points that you want to state in your finding aid. And that's different from the control field that's at the beginning of an EAD finding aid. So you include this information. If it's for the whole collection, you include it inside the archival description tag, but before the DSC tag, because that is specifically for notes. So you can define attributes. Some of the attributes that you can define in your control access fields actually are like links to the specific page in the Library of Congress subject headings, or an identifier. All subject headings also have an identifier in case like some of the wording or formatting changes. It's still like the same like barcode essentially. So you can include that information. You can include the source. So like LCSH, art and architecture thesaurus, those are attributes that you can include. And you can also really break up the different elements of, say, long or multi-part names or subject headings. As I've done in this example, you can separate out the surname, given name, and dates of a particular person. And you can also see in the examples that I've linked to the specific pages at the Library of Congress linked data service for those subject headings. Next slide, please. So the DSC inside the archival description section is a description of subordinate components, which is why we just call it the DSC, because like that almost like doesn't mean anything. It's a description of everything that comes after. So all of your inventory elements are going to be within this tag. So as I said, it's just like at the end of a paper finding aid. This is where the content's right at the end. You've done all of your descriptive information, and now you're doing all of the inventory information. And all of your container tags and titles and dates of the actual stuff in the collection will be within this tag. Next slide, please. So C equals container, and you can also number them. You can have like CO1, CO2. You don't have to, and it can sometimes get confusing. And some if you're generating EAD through a piece of software like ArchivesSpace, sometimes it automatically puts that in. So your Cs exist at different levels, just like in a finding aid where you have series, subseries, folder levels. And so whenever you start a new C, you define what level it's at. And because, you know, an item is part of a folder, is part of a subseries, is part of a series, all of those C tags are going to be nested inside each other, which you can kind of see within this example. You've got the CO1 level equals series, information about the series, and then the files are within that. I haven't closed out that that C tag, that first one. So I think, is that everything I need to say about this? And I wanted to re-emphasize, yeah, this was first in, last out. The series, you open it, all the stuff that's within that series, then you close out all the stuff that's in that series, and then you close out the series itself. Next slide, please. So a DID is a descriptive identification. So that is, it can occur at many different levels of the collection description, like of the collection itself, series level, subseries, folder, item. So you're going to have them in the archival description section before you get to the inventory describing the collection itself. And then you're also going to have within each of your containers all of the descriptive information, like the title, the dates, all of that stuff is also going to be within each container. Next slide, please. So when you're actually done writing, sometimes you can't look at your code anymore. And it makes sense to just use an external validator to make sure that your content works. So if you've ever seen a basic website that looks crazy because they've messed up their coding, that's something you can do in HTML. But like, you know, you forget to close tags out or whatever. But when you have an error in an XML document, the whole document will fail to load. So actually, if I'm uploading to my regional finding aid repository, if the XML code is incorrect, say I've forgotten to close out a tag or I have a typo within the tag itself, then it just won't accept the document. So there are many free validators through things like W3 schools, where I'm sure many of us who had to learn to code have used before. And then the EAD3 toolkit includes several software-specific validation methods. So, you know, if you're coding by hand or doing little updates by hand, rather than just generating the whole thing from a piece of software like ArchivesSpace, you might be using Oxygen, you might be using Dreamweaver, or Notepad++. And so there are different validation capabilities within different pieces of software. But of course, something to know is that your validators will check your code, but they're not going to check for any other potential problems like the content or display errors. So maybe your XML style sheet includes the names of notes as headings, like access and use, biographical, and historical note. So it sees that element, it knows to add a heading. But then if you also include the heading textually, and it's going to display twice. So your validator isn't going to check for things like that. It's not going to look for typos or weird things that you've decided to, like, if you made a mistake in how you're actually formatting your information, like say you forgot all of your paragraph tags and it's all just appearing as a block of text. That's technically, you know, it's not great for our eyes, but for a machine, that isn't an error. So always, you know, proofread or upload and then check how it looks and then make changes really quickly before anyone notices. But once it validates, you can just throw it onto your whatever your hosting repository is, and it will just work. Next slide, please. So, but where are you actually hosting your finding aids? So there are a lot of regionals like Digital Commonwealth or RIAMCO, the one I'm part of, because I'm on the East Coast. A lot of different regional consortia of archivists all over the country have some sort of regional repository, not for necessarily hosting digitized content, but just for hosting finding aids so that people can say, hey, I'm doing research on this thing, and they can search across many institutions in that region. And these types of collaborations, they provide the hosting, but also a group of support, and as well as the centralized discovery. And it's great because within these consortia, you'll often have big universities that have lots of technical expertise, as well as smaller institutions that maybe have an all volunteer staff. They don't have the tech resources to actually host the stuff themselves. So all of those groups of people can depend on each other, learn from each other. There's also been an effort over the past couple of years to build a national finding aid network. So to take all of the, kind of like the Digital Public Library of America, to take all of these regional aggregators and pull all of these finding aids into an uber centralized discovery platform so that it makes doing research even easier. And there's a link in this slide for if you want to get on their mailing list and find out what that effort is doing, and look at some of their documentation. Because I believe it started out as being a grant funded project, and the leaders of the project now are at one of the University of California schools, but there are representatives from all of the different regionals around the country. But you can always just get on their mailing list, see what they're doing. And hopefully we'll be building this at some point. I think we really got slowed down by the pandemic. Next slide, please. So obviously this is a quick overview, not a tutorial. If you want to look at every single tag and see examples of how it is used, there's an amazing resource called eadiva.com. Big shout out to Ruth Kitchen Tillman, who wrote it probably like 10 years ago and then completely updated it when EAD 3 came out. She is an archivist. She has a page for every single element within Encoded Archival Description. Shows how it is used, the types of attributes it might have, shows examples of how it might be used. It's an incredible resource that she just built because she built it because it's something that she wanted to have in the world and would have found useful when she was learning. The official GitHub for EAD also linked here, and they have toolkits and code documentation and things like that. And the Library of Congress also maintains kind of similar to EADiva, but it's like the technical standard. So it's not quite as user friendly if you're just kind of dipping your toes in the water, but also defines each tag. So that is everything that I wanted to say. But I welcome questions. Obviously, this is meant to be a quick overview, because we could do this for a semester.
We'll take questions in just a second. Again, Backlog's the name of the company that put this on. Our next webinar is next Monday, and it's on decoding German scripts. So if you have German ancestors and you have baptism or other records or family letters in German, this helps you identify what script or print it is. So then you can help, and then you can find like an aid to help you decode it. And then we will post this webinar on our YouTube channel, and then I will also email it out to everybody. But if you have a question, yeah.
And if you came to this hoping for more about finding aids in general, I did do one of these webinars maybe like a year ago about parts of a finding aid and about DACS without the EAD component, and that video is on the backlog YouTube. So for anybody who is like, what is all of this? I don't, I just need help writing a finding aid. That video is out there.
That one was called Finding Aid Basics, and I think we did it last April or May. It's been a year now.
Yeah.
But it's on the YouTube. But if anybody has a question, we don't have a chat, but if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, you're more than welcome to. And the finding aid one that Jenna did last year was kind of like a really great, like, where does everything connect and fit in? So that was a really good overview. And then EAD is something that, like, not like an archives buzzword, but something that I hear a lot. And I just thought that, like, we should put this out there to kind of help define it a little bit better. And so we can all see what one looks like. I feel like EAD is something that, like, kind of briefly covered in graduate school, and I've never looked back at it. Or at least from a continuing education perspective. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, my email is on the screen. If you have any questions, you think of anything and you'd like to shout it out to Jenna or I. And then that's also our website. And again, check out the YouTube channel, and you can see we also did one on doubled core. So we've got a lot of good archival basic ones. Lynn, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm not an archivist, so I had just a quick question. Do you have like a concrete example of something that was done with this?
So finding aids that are displayed online. So if you're on, say, like a university archives website, and they've got archives that display not like a linked PDF, but that's all EAD. Or if you're looking at a finding aid, actually that's was created in ArchivesSpace, like you're looking at the public user interface of someone's ArchivesSpace instance, that is also in EAD. The program just does it for you. But like when I submit to riamco.org, so it's riamco.org if you want to see examples. Those are all EAD finding aids. And so we, a few years ago, restructured the whole website. And we didn't have to change any of our finding aids because all that information was encoded. So we just had to change like the style sheet, the really high level stuff. So it's like being able to say, like, I want to paint all the walls in my house, but I don't want to actually have to do it individually. But I have a button that says, I've identified what all the walls are, and I have some sort of function or magic function that says, if it's a wall, paint.
Okay.
Don't know.
Thanks.
Again, I keep doing dumb metaphors, but basically if we tell the computer what the information is, then we can build whatever structure we want around it.
Yeah, and it's really a back end thing to finding aid. So if you look at it, if you watch that webinar, that might give you a little bit more context as to what this is. All right. Well, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thanks, everyone.